So, well, let me begin by just saying, as you know, we live in a world of confusion and chaos and questions. Lots of questions. It's nice to have some sound, solid solutions to the questions people are asking, and God gives us those. He gives us some timeless, truthful, transcendent answers to the most pressing issues that people are asking today, and it's super cool. I'm just proud to say that there are answers that you can trust. There are answers you can put your faith in. There are real answers you can actually live by. And in a world where I can't tell if the FBI is lying or the CIA is telling the truth or the president is in his right mind, or it's like finally someone speaking something you can count on. And today we're in this incredible book of Genesis as we begin, and the answers there are very clear. They're very concise, very clarifying. And I'm like, thank you. They're distinct and defined. They're not only providential, but they're super practical. I mean, today people are still confused. Like, what is a woman? It's like, thank you. This is going to be very helpful because the NCAA can't figure out who should be in a woman's sport or what a woman is. So today, the book of Genesis is probably the most important written piece of literature ever. It is certainly monumental in terms of telling well-known stories, as some of you shared. You've got Adam and Eve, you've got Cain and Abel, you've got the patriarchs, you've got the story of the flood, you've got the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you've got all kinds of stuff, the Tower of Babel, and all those stories they're interesting stories, but they're factual and real events that really help us to explain what is going on now. Genesis is, kind of well known for many of these stories, but what's not well known is how these stories really have changed the world and how they continue to change the world. Because they're true. And no one else has come up with anything better. The book of Genesis is for everyone. That's why if I had my druthers, I'd teach it in the public schools. Not because I want to convert people. I don't want anyone to force me to become what they believe, and I don't want to force anyone else. But the music of Beethoven was not just for the Germans. It's for everyone. The writing of Shakespeare was not just for the Brits and people in England. That writing is for everyone. And the writing of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew canon, or what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of our canon, particularly Genesis, the foundational book of the first 5, this is for everyone. You don't have to be an Israelite. You don't have to be a Jew. You don't have to be a Christian. You're just not going to find these answers anywhere. And no one's come up with better answers. This is a book really designed for everyone. It's had great influence historically. It's the first of the books in the Bible. The Bible is a compilation of books. It's 66 different books. 39 Old Testament books added to 27 New Testament books for 66 books, and this is the first of them all. In fact, you can't even understand the New Testament without the Old, but you couldn't understand that without Genesis. So, I mean, you're in for a total treat. I mean, this is like of all the books we could study. And the fact that we just finished Revelation, which, I mean, these two go together in such a beautiful way. If Genesis were excluded from the canon, somehow someone said, we're taking that one book away, it would be incomprehensible, the Bible. It wouldn't make sense. It would be, as Henry Morris says, it'd like be like a building without a ground floor or a bridge with no support. Genesis is that important. When you turn on the news, you typically hear stuff about Israel. And people are like, why are we still talking about Israel? If we didn't have Genesis, you'd have no idea why we're still talking about Israel. But because of Genesis, we know this is God's chosen people. If we didn't have Genesis, Israel would be like, why would God be so bigoted as to choose one nation? Why would he be so partial? Why would he be so selective? What kind of God is just going to choose? But when you see Genesis, you realize God cares about all people, wants to bless all nations. He just chose a nation to be an instrument to do that. Now all of a sudden everything's different because you understand the context in Genesis. And now you understand, well, why would this one teeny little nation still be hated today? Because God chose it. Why would this nation be so sick? Why couldn't the surrounding countries just take over this teeny little country? They've tried. Because Genesis tells us God's chosen this nation. So there's so much that we wouldn't understand in our world if we didn't have Genesis. When you get to the New Testament and you see God's plan for redemption and saving us and giving us a life that's redeemable, you wouldn't understand, well, why would you need a Savior unless you had Genesis? Because Genesis explains the origins of all things, and therefore it kind of explains the meaning of all things, at least meanings that are inaccessible to man without this book. Why do we know that? Because we know people go to any university, they're trying to solve these issues without this book. And their solutions are inane. They're outright foolish. Some of them are just ridiculous. I mean, it's like people saying people are not binary. They're not men or women. You could be one of 31 flavors, apparently. And it's like so intuitively obvious. It's like, does the emperor have no clothes? I mean, is no one going to say, like, this is so basic. It's so basic as plumbing. But people are confused. Our intellectual elite people are really dumb. They've just kind of lost it. And this book would really help them. But they can't have this book because it points to God. So this book's about origins, and anytime you're dealing with the origin or beginning of something, you're actually dealing too with its purpose. It helps us to understand our purpose in life, and it helps us to understand our destiny and where we're going, and of course our naturalistic, animalistic philosophers of the day, they have a different view of man, and they have a different outcomes. And we've seen that. You don't have to just study the Nazi regime. You can study communism, and anywhere else that you have a godless system, you'll see how people are treated and how dispensable they are. The word Genesis actually means origins. And so Genesis is the only true and reliable account that I'm aware of the origins of the basic entities of the universe and of life. Hebrews would name their books based on the first word in a book. And by the way, we do kind of subject, predicate, verb, we're like Dave went to the store. They put words in order, so do the Greeks, based on importance. Is it to the store Dave went? Well, the store is really important. Or is it that Dave went to the store? Or is it went to the store Dave? It's like, wow. Well, for the Hebrews, the order is important, and the first word is Bereshith, which means in the beginning. So this is the book of beginnings, what we call in Genesis, because of the Latin Vulgate, Genesios was the first word. So it means beginnings, or origins, or source. Or for practical purposes, Genesis is the starting point of everything. It's where you start. It's the beginning. And so it's going to be super, super practical for us in so many ways. I'm super, I feel proud. I don't know if that's the right word, but I just feel proud that God has given us solutions and answers to complicated questions that no one else has come up with better solutions. And it's like, amen. His solutions are truer and they're more fitting. They're certainly more hopeful, but they're just better answers than our secular, naturalistic philosophies that are offered by progressive professors today and political elites and woke so-called scientists who, quite frankly, are giving us solutions that are ridiculous and outright foolish. And you don't need a degree to figure that out. The common farmer in Idaho is like shaking his head like, something's wrong here. Yes, something is wrong. So it's super cool to say to you, we're in for a treat because there's just such good stuff here. For today's purposes, there's several things I wanted to mention to you that this book really addresses. It addresses the origins of lots of different things. The universe, order and complexity, the solar system, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, life, man, and on and on. So I thought, well, let me address some of those just to kind of set us up as we get ready to launch into this great book. Let's start with the origin of the universe. The book of Genesis stands alone in accounting for the actual creation of the basic space, mass, time continuum which constitutes our physical universe. Genesis 1:1, which we'll see next week, is unique in all literature and science and philosophy. Every other system of cosmogony, or of the cosmos, whether it's an ancient religious myth or just some modern scientific model, starts with eternal matter or energy in some form from which other entities are supposedly gradually derived in some process. But only the book of Genesis even attempts to account for this ultimate origin of matter, space, and time. And it does so uniquely in terms of a special creation from God. No one else accounts for that. For all my non-believing friends, scientists, and PhDs, I'm like, that's cool. I think OJ did it. If you don't think he did it, what do you got? And they got nothing. Give me a fingerprint. Come on, anything. A blood stain, DNA, anything. Nothing. They have nothing. Only Genesis gives us this. I think it's super cool. Number two, this book gives us a little bit of the origin of order and complexity. Man's universal observation, both in his personal experience and, of course, in formal study, of physical and biological systems is that order, or at least orderly and complex things, tend naturally to decay into disorder and simplicity. Order and complexity never arise spontaneously. You never just spontaneously get something that's ordered and complex. It's always generated by a prior cause. And it's always programmed to produce such order. This primeval, or programmer, if you will, this programmed purpose, whoever programmed it, is only found in Genesis. And again, I'm trying to talk like my UCLA non-believing scientists talk. Okay, we all see that there's orderly, complex things, and that doesn't just happen. And there's some programmer of some first cause or something. That's great. I love it. Who is it? What do you got? Only Genesis actually boldly comes out and says, it's God. Number three, the solar system. The origin of the solar system. That's the Earth, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars. They appear to be brought into existence by a creator. At least that's what Genesis tells us. And it's small wonder that modern scientific cosmology cosmogonists, people that study the cosmos, have been so notably unsuccessful in attempting to devise a naturalistic theory of the origin of the universe and the solar system. So this is more Jim's department and others, but they're just not doing it. Like, I'm a theologian, but it's like, this isn't my forte, but what do you got? They haven't come up with a good place to stand and go, well, here's our strategy on the origin of the universe. It's like, yeah, but it's got a lot of holes, and a third grader could write a book report on this and kind of poke fun at it. Number 4, in terms of just the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, the Earth is uniquely equipped, as you know, with a great body of liquid water and an extensive blanket, if you will, of oxygen-nitrogen gaseous mixtures, both of which are necessary for life, and they've never developed on other planets, and they're only accounted for by a special creation, which Genesis says is God. No one else has come up with any good theory of why just this planet, why just that mixture, why just those elements. Like, what do you got? This book is amazing. Number 5, the origin of life is given in this book. How living systems could have come into being from non-living chemicals is and will undoubtedly continue to be a total mystery to godless, materialistic philosophers. The marvels of the reproductive process and the almost infinite complexity programmed into the genetic systems of plants and animals are inexplicably, inexplicable except by special creation. At least, if the laws of thermodynamics and probability mean anything at all. The account of the creation of living creatures in Genesis is the only rational explanation. Now, as you can tell, I'm stumbling on a few of the words, like I'm moving into scientific territory. I'm not a scientist, but I read a lot. And I'm open to any scientist who has something that I don't have to chop my head off that makes sense and is rational and believable. But as I go through the literature, there's nothing. It's like, bring it. I'm Google searching. I'm YouTubing. Like, what do you got? Please give us an alternative. No one has it. No one has anything. And if you have it, or if anyone is watching and you have it, send it my way. Because we are followers of the truth. We're not just Jesus freaks. We didn't just choose like, well, we just believe in, we were raised that way, so, we're just tunnel vision. No, we're open. What do you got? But you got to bring it. 6, the origin of man is talked about here in Genesis. Man is the mostly highly organized and complex entity in the universe, so far as we know, possessing not only innumerable, intricate physical, chemical structures, and the marvelous capacities of life and reproduction, but also a nature which contemplates abstract entities like beauty, love, and worship. And we are capable of philosophizing about our own meaning. Our non-Christian friends who imagine man's evolutionary descent from animal ancestors is altogether, in my opinion, whimsical, fanciful, and illusory nonsense. It's just crazy. The true record of the origin of man is recorded for us here in Genesis. You can take it to the bank. This is how we know who we are. No Marx. We're not economic beings. No Freud. We're not just sexual beings. No. We are actually image bearers of a God. But you wouldn't know that unless you had Genesis. And because they've ruled out God, they don't know who man is. 7, marriage. The origin of marriage is right here in Genesis, the remarkably universal and stable institution of monogamous marriage between a husband as head and a wife as helpmate as the foundation of every family and home is described here in Genesis. And it's described as being ordained by God, the Creator. Everything else is a problem. Promiscuity, polygamy, matriarchy, divorce, abortion, infanticide, homosexuality, effeminacy, LGBTQ, other corruptions. They all developed later. This is not God's idea. They're all rejected by God. And it's so clear in Genesis. Like this is just the first book of our canon. It's like you don't have to go any further. This is how he made it. For everyone, for all time, in every country. Every part of the world. 8, Genesis also gives us the origins of evil. Cause and effect reasoning accounts for the origin of the concepts of perhaps goodness, truth, beauty, love, such fundamental attributes of the Creator himself. The origin of physical and moral evils, however, in the universe is explained in Genesis as a temporary intrusion into God's perfect world, allowed as a concession by God to accommodate the principles of human freedom and responsibility, and also to manifest himself as our Redeemer and our Creator. So we learn from Genesis that evil is internally present in men, now born in sin, who have sick, selfish, wayward, impure hearts. And despite what our, if I could say it, naive, gullible, deceived, liberal, progressive friends may think, was that tactful? Could I say it nicer? I don't know. People are not basically good. And because our liberal friends think people are basically good, they don't even teach goodness. They don't realize, no, they're not good. Goodness has to be taught. Values have to be taught. Ethics have to be taught and infused and imparted. It's not just a self-esteem movement we're trying to be a part of. We're image bearers. So evil is not caused by external social conditions like a poor education or poverty or climate. Every family in Genesis is, can I say it, dysfunctional? Every family in Genesis highlights how troubled our human condition is. We go from Adam and Eve, who had Cain and Abel, and I don't know, apparently the school system was really bad because one of them got really angry and, well, had an accident. No, he murdered his brother because man has an internal problem, and it wasn't the neighborhood. So Genesis alone is the only adequate explanation of Nazism or communism or how worthless good intentions are without wisdom. And Genesis therefore explains to us why really educated people here in the West, with all their knowledge and all their intelligence, are so dumb and are some of the greatest supporters of the most evil ideologies and regimes. They're just outright stupid. But they sure know a lot. But they're not wise. Because they don't know Genesis. It's all there in the first book. Number 9, this book gives us the origin of language. Now, the gaping gulf between just the chatterings of animals and the intelligent, abstract, symbolic communication systems of mankind is completely unbridgeable by any godless evolutionary process. No, you don't just come up with, we were in the cave and we were just, but then we had language. No. The book of Genesis not only accounts for the origin of language in general, but also for the various national languages in particular. Only Genesis gives us that. It's just so cool. 10, Genesis gives us the origin of government. The development of organized systems of human government is described in Genesis, with man responsible not only for his own actions, but also for the maintenance of some orderly social structures through systems of laws and punishments. And like you're supposed to get the bad guys and protect the good guys, apparently that's very confusing for our government even today. Who you're supposed to lock up and who you're supposed to let out, they apparently aren't tracking with how that works. But it's right here in Genesis for us. Number 11, origin of culture. The book of Genesis describes the beginning of many entities now associated with civilized cultures. You could go on. Urbanization, music, agriculture, animal science, writing, education, navigation, textiles. I could go on, right? But they're here in Genesis. 12, Genesis gives us the origin of nations. Despite all the crazy racial nonsense going on today, all true scholars accept the essential unity of the human race. The problem then is how distinct nations and ethnicities could develop if all men were originally from one race with one language. How do you get those distinctions? Genesis tells us. It has the only adequate answer for how that happened. Like, how did we get different ethnicities if our parents were from one origin? It tells us. No one else has a good answer. No one else has come up with anything that I would like go, that's something I should think about. 13, the origin of religion comes to us in Genesis. There are many different religions among men, as you know. I've traveled many countries, and they all do seem to share a consciousness that there must be some ultimate truth, some ultimate meaning to which man should move towards. They have different solutions to what that is, but they all seem to have that. Many of these religions obviously take an organized form of worship and conduct and stuff, but just the origin of this unique characteristic of man's consciousness, that there should be some form of worship or something bigger than themselves, how did that come about? Genesis tells us. We were made worshipers. We were made, every man, no matter what country they're from or what faith they have, senses there's something outside themselves. The origins of that consciousness, Genesis tells us, is God-given. And of course, just the idea of God's chosen people. I mean, if you didn't have Genesis, you wouldn't understand the enigma of the Israelites. This is a country that for 19 centuries had no homeland. And yet they gave us the Bible, the knowledge of the true God. They gave us really the initial forms of Christianity, even though ultimately they reject Christianity. They've given us some of the world's greatest art, music, science, finance, other products of the human mind. There's no way to explain, why does the world so hate this one little country? Who would care about Zimbabwe or Ecuador or some little country? But everyone seems to care about Israel. They're in the news of every country, every day of every week. Genesis tells us why. So I could go on and on. I just made a little bit of a list of just there's so much that just the scholars of the world just don't have anything on, but Genesis seems to have answers to many of these very perplexing questions of the day, which I think is super cool. So in my opinion, Genesis then is the foundation really of all true history. And therefore, it's the foundation of all true science and all true philosophy. It's certainly the foundation of God's revelation to us. It's the first book of his revelation. In the Bible, it's the most quoted and most referred to book. It's just key. If you didn't have Genesis, it's just all throughout the whole canon. Adam himself is mentioned in the books of Deuteronomy, Job, 1 Chronicles. Noah is mentioned in 1 Chronicles, Isaiah, Ezekiel. Abraham is mentioned in 15 of the Old Testament books and 11 of the New Testament books. Jacob is mentioned in 22 Old Testament books and 17 New Testament books. Like, if you took these people out, like, they're mentioned everywhere in the scriptures. And Israel which was named after Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and his 12 sons became the 12 tribes. We wouldn't understand all of that if we didn't have Genesis. In fact, in the New Testament, 165 passages from Genesis are either directly quoted or referred to in the New Testament. And over 200 quotations or allusions from Genesis are in the New Testament. So even the New Testament, like, you could think, oh, it's just Genesis. It's like, you wouldn't even understand the New Testament. It's just all in there. We're going to be dealing primarily, at least initially, with these first 11 chapters of Genesis. And because these are so foundational to understanding the origins and the beginning and the starting point of so many things, it's no wonder that these 11 chapters are the most attacked chapters probably in the whole canon. I mean, there's more skepticism, doubt, scientific inquiry, philosophical wondering about these chapters. Why? Because if these chapters are true, then we are way off course. But if these chapters were just myths or stories, they're just allegories. You know, there's not a real flood with real water. Those shells you see in Arizona in the Grand Canyon, that sediment with those fish that were stuck in the rocks, I don't know how they got there, but it can't be like a true story about a real flood or something, like, you know, because if there was, then we have a problem. Because if Genesis is true, all of our liberal friends are in trouble. And they are in trouble. So I'm like, come on, guys.
Wake up.
Wake up. There you go, Alice. This is the most historical, true, authoritative book on history in general. Not because other history accounts don't have good history to them, but when you go back to, how did we get here? What's the first cause? Like, what started it all? No one has that but Genesis. So I'm just brimming. Like, this is going to be super, super exciting, this series. It's just key to so much. One writer says, no one, therefore, can hope to attain a true and full understanding of anything without a basic acceptance and comprehension of the origins of everything as recorded in Genesis. Wow. So we live today in a kind of a woke, weird, godless, globalist world where, of course, people don't believe in the Bible. And why would they? Because if you go to a university, they don't teach the Bible. And if you go to a church today, they're typically very TED Talkish. You'll get a little weak devotional. There's not like a lot of serious Christians around. There's a lot of liberal professors around. The world is so woke and cool now, no one needs God. And then if you do believe in God, you're probably a theistic evolutionist, which you believe God probably caused it, but an evolutionary, like, we've already conceded on so many fronts. It's like, no. Genesis says, no, it's crazy. These are not myths. These are not allegories. These are actual, factual records of real events with real people. And if you think there's something else, bring it. But if not, zip it. Genesis is not only a great historical record, but when you get to chapter 12 and it starts to move on, it's almost like a really intimate diary of some of the most fascinating men and women who've ever walked the earth. And perhaps after we get through the first 11 chapters, we'll decide, do we want to keep going? And maybe we'll pick some highlights of, who knows? There's some great stuff in there. Today, before we launch into this book, verse by verse, I just want to remind you, who wrote this book? Moses, right? Moses. Jewish scholars and Christians alike throughout the testimony of the world have always believed Moses was the author. How did he write it? I don't totally know. He could have gotten just direct revelation from God. That's possible. There certainly was oral tradition because, he wasn't there when Adam was around. He wasn't there, during some of the original stuff, but oral tradition could have been passed on. He recorded that and then put that in his account. There also could have been a lot of firsthand accounts that were passed on, like Adam wrote some things, and Abel and wrote some things, and they passed those on. So I think Moses is definitely the author of Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but Genesis, I think he's probably not only the author of it, but he's probably also like a compiler, if you will, an editor, so to speak. Luke was like that in the Gospel of Luke. Luke says, I'm going to lay out an account of the Gospel of Christ. And he's like, I've compiled some of the eyewitness testimony, and I'm going to put that together in a recorded example for you so that you have not only the writings of Luke, but the collections of Luke. I think Moses is the author and the collector and compiler of these original autographs and puts them together. He is the writer of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, what we also call the Torah, which Jesus refers to also as the law, the first 5 books. So I think Moses is our guy. He's mentioned, by the way, 80 times in the New Testament, so Moses is a big figure. I thought I might mention, too, just for our purposes, since we just finished finished Revelation, Genesis and Revelation, they do go together perfectly, because in Genesis you have paradise lost, and in Revelation you have paradise kind of regained, right? Restored. And so we're going to get both bookends, which is super, super cool. We already know from Revelation, we studied kind of the final world that we're going to. Genesis gives us the first world we were in. So you have kind of the probationary world in Genesis, and then you have the eternal world in Revelation. In Genesis, you're going to see the division of light and darkness, and in Revelation, there's no more night. In Genesis, you have the division of land and sea. In Revelation, no more sea. In Genesis, you have the creation of the sun and the moon. In Revelation, no more sun and moon. In Genesis, you have man is prepared in a garden. In Revelation, he's now prepared for a city. In Revelation, you have the river flowing out of Eden. And then in Revelation, it's now flowing out of God's throne. You have gold in the land in Genesis. You have gold in the city in Revelation. It goes back and forth. The point is, these are perfect bookends to what God originally wanted for us, and then, how he's going to restore that in the end and bring us back. So here in Genesis, we're going to have kind of a cursed world, a world that's going to fall and go bad. And we just looked in Revelation, we have kind of the eternal world of how God's going to bring what he originally wanted back for us. So in Genesis, we're going to have the cursed ground. In Revelation, we have the eternal world with no more curse whatsoever. Here we're going to have a daily sorrow, which some of us are experiencing sorrow. In Revelation, we saw eventually no more sorrow. In Genesis, there's going to be thorns and thistles. In Revelation, we see that there's not going to be any more thorns and thistles. No more pain like that. Sweat of the face is Genesis. In Revelation, no more tears. No more tears. So they go back and forth. Here in Genesis, you'll see evil is continual. Of course, there's nothing that defiles in the eternal state. Here you're going to see Satan showing up right off the bat. By the way, he's alive and well and opposing us. Of course, in Revelation, he is dethroned, banished, and put away forever in the lake of fire. In Genesis, we're going to see that Adam and Eve are kept from the tree of life. Of course, it's fully accessible in the eternal state. They're going to be banished from the garden. But of course, in Revelation, they're free in the city. And we're going to see just a lot of parallels. Having just studied Revelation, I just want you to know, you're going to start to see, wow, we just looked at this, and now we're seeing that. And they do go together beautifully. Before I close, why don't I give you just a brief outline of kind of how this book is ordered for us. It's super, super simple, but here's kind of, Chuck Swindoll actually made this initial outline. I think he did a great job of keeping it super simple. The first 11 chapters are the core chapters that we're going to be looking at initially, but chapters 12 through 50 are like the second half. And that little gray band in the middle is like, that's the hinge. The first 11 chapters, which we're going to look at, are a little bit different than the patriarchs, which is the second half. So the first part is really the beginning of the human race, right? And the second part is really the beginning of the chosen race, if you will. There are really 4 primary or major events in these first 11 chapters: creation, the fall, the flood, and the nations. Those are kind of in simple language, like the key things. But I just gave you like 14 different origins, right? Language and manhood and marriage. Like there's a lot of key origins we're going to see in these first 11 chapters. The second half is basically 4 really important people. There's certainly more people than that, but it's definitely going to deal with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And I don't think we'll be teaching through all of those passages, but I think we will probably do some highlights of the second half of the book, because there's just some key stories that I think pull it together. But I think we will go verse by verse on these first 11 chapters, because they're so good. I'll confess with you, next week I'm ready to go Genesis 1:1, and I'm already studying verse 1. I'm like, I don't even know if I'm going to get to verse 2.
5 times as long as Revelation.
It's just, how many years do you have, right? I know it's going to go a little faster, but even just the first words of Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, the fact that there's a beginning, the ancient world didn't know that, right? We didn't know till 1929, apparently, right? They thought it was all eternal, all these gases and all this stuff. No, it's not eternal. Genesis tells us, in the beginning. In the beginning what? God. What? I thought it was the sun and the moon and the stars that everyone was worshiping. No, those aren't deities. It's God who created, God created. In the beginning, God created. What? Don't get me going. Alice, slow me down. That's next week. I don't know. So if we only get one verse next week, it's just, okay, I'll go faster after that. But anyways, here's basically our basic outline. You just have confusion and scattering in the first part, bondage in Egypt, primeval history, patriarchal history. First part's 2,000-year period. The last half is about 300 years. Again, 4 major events, 4 major people. But the bottom line is God promises to redeem his people and to bless us, and that's what the New Testament's about. That's why Christ came. But it all makes sense when you understand the beginning. And we're just going to have a great, great time. So if you're like, where do I go from here? What do I do? Get Genesis out and start reading it, and read it, and read it, and read it, and go over and read it, particularly the first 11 chapters, and read it in the New American Standard Version, then read it in the New International Version, and then read it in the Living Bible, and then read it in the Message, and then read the kids' stories, and just find every way you can get that in, and then come here ready to be blown away. Because we live in a world that is super confused. They're super lost. I've never really liked calling people lost, but now it's that's the nicest term I can come up with. You just seem so lost. Marriage isn't supposed to be that confusing. Manhood isn't supposed to be that confusing. Womanhood, family life, it's not supposed to. In fact, God created distinctions. We'll see that in Genesis, distinctions, so it was clear. Today, we're in a world that's eliminating distinctions and trying to be fluid and messy and complex and layered. Sounds so woke and weird. And it's killing people. Young people are taking their lives. They don't know who they are. They're miserable and anxious. And I want to say, come join us on Sundays. We've got some answers. And these answers are clear, concise, and clarifying. They're distinct and defined. They're not only providential, they're practical. And we have it all here in Genesis. Amen?
Amen.